It's been a while since I've done an Indiana Jones video, but I recently rewatched all of them and I wound up curious about a few topics, because while I loved the Indiana Jones movies, I am not nearly as versed in its books or comics or even the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. So today we're going to talk about Belloc and his history with Indy before Raiders of the Lost Ark. Rene Belloq was born in France, apparently the descendant of members of the Templars. He grew up admiring history and French archaeologists and decided to become one himself. He wound up studying at the University of Paris, where Henry Jones Jr. was also studying at the time. The two actually met at a dig in Iraq, where Belloc wound up running off with several artifacts to sell on the black market. Back at school, he also stole one of Jones's papers and passed it off as his own to win the Archaeological Society Prize. There was not sufficient evidence for either crime to prove his treachery. Belloc briefly worked as an assistant curator at the Louvre until his dark dealings finally caught up with him. He funded grave robbers in Persia that caused the deaths of several museum employees and an archaeologist. Fired from the Louvre and without a job, he became a mercenary. In the 1930s, he was hired by the Nazis to find a Norse artifact called the Uppsala Scroll. He stole it from Marcus Brody, and therefore Indiana Jones, who tracked Belloc to Marrakesh and stole it back. 1 year later, the two found themselves competing again in a race to find the invincible ruby of Ali Bey. The treasure hunt led them to Kenya, where the ruby was revealed to be lethal. It was lost when the palace that held it collapsed in on itself, and both men left empty-handed. In 1933, Indy and Belloc wound up searching for a crystal skull of all things, the Crystal Skull of Kozan. Rene found it on the black market and sold it to some Nazis who attempted to have him killed. So Belloc provided Jones with information to retrieve the skull, but Indy refused to work with him and they wound up in a duel, which of course they both survived. And wouldn't you know it, in 1935, Belloc was even hunting for the remains of Nurhaci at the same time as Indy. Jones found the urn first and turned it over to the gangster Lao She in exchange for a large diamond, which Rene also had his eyes on. Unfortunately, Indy lost it during his escape from Shanghai. When Belloc heard his rival's plane had crashed in India, he sought to confirm Jones's death, but instead learned of Indy's heroics in returning a stolen Sankara stone to a small village. Not long after, he heard of an expedition to Peru led by the archaeologist Forrestal to find a sacred golden idol. Learning of the elder explorer's death and not wanting to brave the temple's traps himself, Belloc tipped Indiana Jones off on the temple's location and waited. Once his rival had taken the bait, all he had to do was tell the local Jovitos tribe that an outsider wanted to violate their sacred ground. He took the idol from Indy and sold it to his black market contacts still in Marrakesh. Shortly after, he was contacted by the Nazi Colonel Dietrich and was hired to find the Lost Ark of the Covenant. But if you're watching this, you probably know how that ends. Indy finds the Ark, Belloc steals the Ark, Belloc opens the Ark, Belloc's head is exploded by holy fire. It's funny, the story of Belloc and Indiana Jones reminds me of Han and Lando in Star Wars Legends. All we knew about Han and Lando's relationship when Empire came out was that at some point Han did something to upset Lando. So then every story about the two of them that took place prior to Empire meant Han had to double-cross Lando or do something bad enough to be worried about it years later. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, all we really know about Indy and Belloc is that they were rivals, and the French archaeologists seemed to have a habit of taking anything Indy found. So that's what all their stories seem to revolve around. But there you have it, a quick look at Belloc's history with Indiana Jones. If there are any other Indy topics you'd like to see, please leave them in the comments. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for mostly Star Wars, but occasionally Indiana Jones content, follow us on Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and consider checking out our Patreon page. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.